From Harvard University.
Okay, thank you very much. I am here in part to represent some of the activities of the International Society for Stem Cell Research. We've just heard about the sort of enforcement side, and we've heard a lot today about the regulatory side. We obviously appreciate there is a market, is an active market in various types of stem cell therapies. And what I'm going to talk about are two efforts that the ISSCR has made. On the one hand, to try to inform the supply side through professional guidelines, and the other to try to influence the demand side through patient education. But I want to start just by telling you a little bit about who I am. I'm a physician and a scientist, and I am the director of our pediatric stem cell transplant program at Children's Hospital. And I know Irv Weissman always bristles when we use that title, but fundamentally we're really talking about transplanting either bone marrow or cord blood or mobilized peripheral blood, the active agent of which is hematopoietic stem cell transplant. But I also run a very active laboratory that works on both adult and pluripotent and embryonic stem cells, and I served as the ISSCR president in 2007-2008. Let me just start with a quick case study, because I think everyone would agree that there's a wide spectrum of treatments offered in the context of this market for cell therapies. On the one hand, we can all agree that there's a fair amount of quackery and charlatanism going on. But on the other end of the spectrum is a group of really well-intentioned, but perhaps somewhat misinformed, and certainly from the scientific and medical perspective, premature efforts to actually widely disseminate this work. This has happened before. And a very, very good example was what happened in response to some very favorable early-stage pilot data in the early 80s around using high-dose chemotherapy for women with metastatic breast cancer in the setting of autologous marrow or stem cell transplant rescue. That early positive data was then expanded to different patient sets, women who had less aggressive disease, and the results then seemed to be even more promising. And it was, in a sense, medical entrepreneurship run amok, because what happened was, before there were real credible randomized data to say that this actually worked better than the standard of care of high-dose chemotherapy, there were literally tens of thousands of women being transplanted. One of our own Harvard hospitals had an entire floor dedicated to this transplant strategy. And it was only in May of 1999, when there were several reports at the ASCO meeting of randomized data, which basically failed to show any enhanced efficacy, but did hint at worse toxicity, that this really almost logarithmic growth in autologous marrow transplant for breast cancer started then to wane. So this is just an example of, even in the best of circumstances, in a highly regulated community of well-intentioned physicians here in the United States, we had this sort of imposition of commercialization and entrepreneurship in a fledgling area of stem cell therapy, and I think it's a cautionary tale. Now, the International Society for Stem Cell Research is the largest professional organization of stem cell scientists, but we have a strong interest as part of our strategic plan to influence and encourage responsible clinical translation. And we are really here to educate scientists and medical practitioners. We are acting on the one hand through imposition of professional standards, and of course you realize that's part of the limitation, because we're preaching to the converted. And so we are working towards moving towards better information and the training of translational physician scientists, but we're also operating on the other side, which is to put forth patient education, and at the very least, we're through the Closer Look website, which I'll mention briefly, and Irv mentioned in his remarks, we're trying to spotlight clinics who are marketing these unproven treatments. So why are stem cells different? Why do they require something special? Well, they're different because they're novel. I mean, obviously we've had blood stem cell transplants, but they don't have the same properties as drugs. They don't have the same properties as antibodies and biologics. If they are, in fact, based on true stem cells, they persist in the patient, which generates a whole set of challenges for long-term monitoring and the problems of long-term adverse outcomes. And we appreciate that the science is early and that many of even our best animal models are only partly predictive. So in about 2007, when I was president, we were, many of us got together and decided to impanel a broad international task force. It had 30 members, all listed here, from 14 countries. The task force was chaired by In-Soo Hyun, a bioethicist from Cleveland, and Ola Lindvall, a physician, scientist, one of the pioneers of fetal cell transplant for Parkinson's. But you'll see scattered through this list many major figures in gene therapy. We had surgeons, we had patients and patient advocates, and together we struggled for many, many months and came up with a set of professional guidelines. Fundamentally, the principles that we were trying to promulgate were to insist on a high standard of preclinical evidence. We know that most novel therapies, whether drugs, biologics, or cells, are likely to fail, failing either based on unforeseen toxicity, poor clinical hypotheses, and lack of efficacy. So we felt in this new fledgling area it was important that we insist on a high standard of preclinical evidence. We also, as you'll see again and again, the concept of peer review, absolutely essential, especially expert peer review, sort of area-specific peer review, which in a new area is likely to be somewhat hard to come by. We asked for very scrupulous reviews of clinical protocols by the IRB, once again supplemented by stem cell expertise, which in most instances didn't pre-exist on those IRBs. The influence of our bioethicists on the group really educated all of us about the importance of rigorous informed consent and the imperative that in this new area, any kind of work, have it at its core, gathering new information, being able to then promulgate that information through publication, whether it be positive or negative. And we've already heard the real risks of reporting bias and the likelihood that much of what gets published is that which has positive evidence. And one of the deliverables was this patient handbook, an attempt to provide patients with a list of information, questions, sort of arming them with the right material that they could make informed decisions. Now, of course, the tension that we're revisiting again and again through our questions is how do we advance what is a promising yet inchoate science and really maintain the prospects of medical innovation in the setting of all these uncertainties and unknowns. And the surgeons on our panel made it quite clear that innovation is happening in the context of medical practice all the time, and we have to add regulatory constraints on top of that at some risk. So we had and spent quite a bit of time articulating what we felt were the important principles for preserving opportunities for medical innovation. And those principles had to do with the following, which was medical innovation is only innovative if it's really focused on a very small number of seriously ill patients. Medical innovation isn't happening when you're already marketing it to dozens or hundreds of individuals. There should be a written plan. Now, some innovation in the setting of a surgery happens in real time. But what we're talking about in most instances for stem cell interventions are things that they require a significant amount of advanced planning. And so in the context of medical innovation, it was felt that there should be a written plan, there should be compelling rationale, there should be scrupulous quality control and characterization of cells that should be produced under high rigorous standards of manufacturing practice. There should be the bedrock principle of voluntary informed consent, considerations of cost, considerations of what happens if there are adverse events, and institutional accountability. There should be, again, the notion of peer review and review by external experts. And after noting the innovative effort, this should follow very quickly into a formal clinical trial process so that these innovations can benefit everyone in the community. It's part of our professional imperative as physicians to create generalizable knowledge. Now, these issues have been spoken to. The Declaration of Helsinki is, in fact, one of the cornerstone documents of medical research, first reported in 1964 and updated many, many times, most recently just in October of this year. And there is a special section that speaks directly to the use of unproven interventions in clinical practice. And it says, in the treatment of the individual patient, where proven interventions do not exist or other known interventions have been ineffective, the physician, after seeking expert advice with informed consent from the patient, may use an unproven intervention if it is in the physician's judgment and offers hope of saving lives. This intervention should subsequently be made the object of research designed to evaluate its safety and efficacy. In all cases, new information must be recorded and, where appropriate, made publicly available. Now, I think you'll see that some of these elements were indeed captured and are reflective of the types of standards for medical innovation that we wrote into the ISSCR guidelines. But we engaged with the authors and revisionists of the Declaration of Helsinki too late to actually have an impact on the wording, because we felt in many cases this is really not defined enough. It doesn't really speak to the numbers of patients, the imperative to move past a very small number of patients and to move it into formal clinical trials. And we hope that we will have more prescriptive influence when this is revised in the future, because this statement is being used by practitioners around the globe to justify their use of what are clearly unproven interventions for far more than just the few individuals of their patients. I'll just say briefly what Irv first mentioned. The ISSCR guidelines for stem cell translation are professional guidelines, and in many instances, they really are preaching to the converted. Most of the folks who would take the effort to read those guidelines are likely to follow them. But on the other side, we also felt it was important to provide the patients on the demand side with more information so that they could make informed decisions. This was another task force chaired by Patrick Taylor and impaneled when Irv Weissman was president. It constructed this very effective website, which really received an enormous amount of attention early on. It had various folks giving commentary, and it articulated, this effort articulated a sort of attempt to gain information through this process, where ultimately we could try to qualify the nature of these clinical interventions so that the various websites could be codified as either an entity that was, in a sense, lacking professional documentation or one that would actually pass our muster. And as Irv mentioned, this in practice didn't seem tenable for the society when, in fact, there was a case of a letter written from an attorney. It carried the threat of lawsuits. The society does not have the resources to be able to fight such a lawsuit. And so this aspect, this sort of oversight aspect of this website has really been put on hold, and it really just exists as an informational platform. So let me just finish by saying there are many ways of regulating the practice of stem cell therapies through community and professional standards, regulatory oversight, market forces, and we do feel that extra emphasis is really needed also addressing the needs of patients and families. And I look forward to taking questions in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Now we are going to shift to the role of the professional societies in quality assurance, and we'll first hear from Douglas Sipp from the International Society for Cellular Therapy.